part of the chapter, verses 17 through 40. I've titled the message tonight, Jerusalem, Report, and Trouble. Remember, Paul has had it on his heart. He's trying to make it to Jerusalem. And he's been warned, and he's been loved on, hugged on, and threatened, please don't go. And we've seen several sad departs where he had left, and he had told the Ephesian church. Let me just redress that a little bit. Remember what happened over there where the Ephesians were? We had the coppersmiths that got in an uproar, and they tried to throw him out and run him off. You know, they just went out of business and he had because he's putting out all the false gods and idols that they had. And that's going to come back to play a little bit here in a minute, but I just want to kind of give you get your mind back to what we've been studying. Paul's pressing. We discussed whether or not Paul was out of the will of God by going forward and going on to Jerusalem. And it's in my opinion, and my opinion is just like yours, it really don't count for much, but it helps me to piece the word of God here. So, in your own mind, you may think he was in the will of God or out of the will of God, but I believe the Bible supports that God's in charge. God allows us to make decisions, but our decisions, God can avert or overcome them. We'll see that happen in the verses we'll read here in just a minute, but we'll have some discussion about this. So pay close attention. I'm going to try to read it. We'll start reading in verse number 17 for all the way through the chapter. And remember, Paul's been pushing to get there. And he's there. He arrives. Verse 17. And when we were come to Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly. You know, as we go, I'm going to try to highlight some things. When I go back home, or we go back to our home church, it's a glad time. It's a good time. The majority of the time, people embrace us. They love on us. It's just good because they know our family. They know what we're doing. They support us. And it's a good thing normally when we go home. And not just our home church, but the other churches that we visit. You know, it's good. When Christians get together with fellowship, it's good. I mean, it's like you could have been away for 5 or 6 years, and then when you come back into each other's presence, it's like you haven't been away very long, been apart very long. My mic on. There you go. It's on. But anyway, let's pick up reading in verse number 17. And we were coming to Jerusalem. The brethren received us gladly. And the day following, Paul went in with us unto James, and all the elders were present. And when he had saluted them, he declared particularly what things God had wrought among the Gentiles by his ministry. And when they heard it, they glorified the Lord and said unto him, Thou seest, brother, how many thousands of Jews there are which believe, and they are all zealous of the law. Now, that's an issue. Remember, Paul's a Jew. But remember, Paul is the preacher to the Gentiles. He preaches, he loves his countrymen, but his countrymen are hung up in Judaism, in keeping the law. And this is as soon as he gets to Jerusalem. Now, let me remind you, Paul didn't come to Jerusalem empty-handed. Remember all those churches, they had an offering, and Paul was to bring that offering to the Jerusalem church. That was one of the reasons he was pressing to get there. The Gentile churches, the Gentile Jew churches that he had established, that God had used him, had took up an offering and were sending it back to Jerusalem to help them because the church in Jerusalem was struggling. So just as a side note, verse number 20, when they heard it, they glorified the Lord and said unto him, Thou seest, brother, how many thousands of Jews there are which believe, and they are all zealous of the law, and they are informed of thee that thou teachest all the Jews which are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, neither to walk after their customs. What is it, therefore, the multitude must needs come together, for they will hear that thou art come. Do therefore this that we say to thee. We have 4 men which have a vow on them. Them take and purify thyself with them, and be at charges with them, that they may shave their heads, and all may know that those things whereof they were informed concerning thee are nothing, but that thou thyself also walk orderly and keepest the law. As touching the Gentiles, which believe, we have written and concluded that they observe no such things, save only that they keep themselves from things offered to idols, and from blood of, and from strangled, and from fornication. Then Paul took them in, and the next day, purifying himself with them, entered into the temple to signify the accomplishments of the days of purification, until that an offering should be offered for every one of them. Let me stop. I've read a lot, and there's a lot has happened. So Paul's in Jerusalem. The church has received him. They've had a short, brief, glorious time of rejoicing in what God has done through Paul, establishing these other churches. You got to realize Paul has done more for the cause of Christ than any of the other apostles that are in Jerusalem. And now we're visiting this same issue, circumcision. Remember, several chapters back, we talked about it and how the Jerusalem church had ruled and sent the letters and sent people to represent the Jerusalem church to the other churches he had established. He said they're telling him this, but now they're telling him he needs to walk in the law. So here's where the question's starting to form. And Paul has agreed to it. We see Paul hadn't argued with them. He's willing to do whatever he needs to win his countrymen. He loves them that much. So let's pick back up reading verse number 27. And when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews which were of Asia, that's back where he had all the trouble with Alexander and all the coppersmiths, and when they saw him in the temple, they stirred up all the people and laid hands on him, crying out, Men of Israel, help! This is the man that teacheth all men everywhere against the people and the law and this place, and further brought the Greeks also into the temple, and hath polluted this holy place. For they had seen before him with the city of Trophimus an Ephesian, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. And all the city was moved, and the people ran together, and they took Paul and drew him out of the temple, and forthwith the doors were shut. And as they went about to kill him, tidings came unto the chief captain of the band that all Jerusalem was in an uproar, who immediately took soldiers and centurions and ran down unto them. And when they saw the chief captain and the soldiers, they left beating of Paul. Then the chief captain came near and took him and commanded him to be bound with 2 chains, and demanded who he was and what he had done. So here again, let's pause. What's happened? Well, Paul has agreed. Paul's going through, and he's going to walk as a Jew. He's going to go, and he's going to allow them to sacrifice. Now, there's a lot of things that's a problem with this. We know Paul's heart. He loves his Jewish mates. He loves those Jewish people. He said he would do whatever it would take that the Jews would come to know Christ. So we can't really fault Paul, but he's went to the Gentile churches, and the Gentiles know there is no more sacrifices. Now, the book of Acts ties all the New Testament books together, and this is where all the action happens. So Paul has decided, and you can say whether he's in the will of God or out of the will of God, but we can see what happens is he's going to go through with this, but before the sacrifice takes place, he gets caught by the Jewish enemies, the ones that are against him. And that happened in verse number 26. They caught him, and this is how I look at it. So God prevented him from doing that extra sacrifice. And God allowed him to be took captive. But let's follow along verse 33. The chief captain came near, took him and commanded. Now the Romans have come and got him, and they've picked him up. They've kept him from being killed right there outside of the temple, because the Jews were beating on him. They were going to kill him. But the Romans come in and stopped it. The chief captain came near, took him and commanded him to be bound, 2 chains. Now he's cuffed and stuffed, for a better way of putting it, and demanded who he was, what he had done. And some cried one thing, some another among the multitude. And when he could not know the certainty for the turmoil, he commanded him to be carried into the castle. And when he came up upon the stairs, so it was that he was borne of the soldiers for the violence of the people. For the multitude of the people followed after, crying, "Away with him." Have you ever heard that before? Have you ever heard that term used? Away with him? What did that happen on the Damascus road? What did God tell him? He was going to suffer for him. And it's all starting to come to pass. Verse 37, and as Paul was to be led into the castle, he said unto the chief captain, "May I speak unto thee?" Who said, "Canst thou speak Greek? Art thou not the Egyptian, which before days made us an uproar, and led us out into the wilderness 4,000 men that were murderers?" But Paul said, "I am a man which am a Jew of Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I beseech thee, suffer me to speak unto the people." And when he had given him license, Paul stood on the stairs and beckoned with the hand unto the people. And when there was made a great silence, he spake unto them in the Hebrew tongue, saying, we're going to stop there. You have to come next week and we'll get into what he says in actual speech. But let's go back and look at what all took place here. So we start off in verse 17 through 20, and we see this Christian fellowship. Paul has been on a journey. This will be the end of his journeys, but he's been journeying to get to Jerusalem. It's like a long lost friend of the church. Like some of y'all have went to church with for years, and they haven't been coming here, and they show up here. Well, how would you welcome them? You'd welcome them with open arms. You would greet them. You would be excited. You'd do some catching up. You'd love on one another. Let me tell you something about Christian fellowship. It's sweet. It's sweet. When I go home and the people that were in the church the day I announced my call to preach, they know who I am, and they remember that. And they've seen all of my children born and raised in the church. And it's a blessing when Christian fellowship is had. When we have a fellowship after the service, it's a blessing for me to sit down and visit with you and talk with you, expect those that I've had a part in ministering to, baptized you, or whatever the case may be. It's just sweet when you have Christian fellowship. It's sweet. Not only is it sweet, it's savory. It's good to dwell with those of faith. It's good to be a part of God's church. You know, what's amazing to me is I have been out of the country. I have been to Mexico. I went down there unannounced, uninvited, to check on a work. And when I got there, and then the church finally got to showing up and service started, as I sat in a chair and with a group of people I couldn't even talk to, Jared, the relaxation set in. Because I was among God's people, God's family, and I felt at home with them, even though I couldn't understand a lick they were saying. When they were up there and they'd be going, Jesus, 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 I could figure out what the song was. I didn't know no Spanish, but it was just a peace about it. Now, on the way down there, it wasn't quite that way. We were in a foreign country. We were going down through the middle of nowhere, which is what it looked like. I mean, it wasn't nothing. Then all of a sudden, here's a bunch of armored cars and vehicles and soldiers out in the middle of the desert, pretty much. And, you know, I was scared to death. I'm like, this ain't good. And I'll do what, when you get nervous about things, keep your mouth shut. That's what I did. So we got through that. We got down there, and then when we was with the church, it was a relaxation. It was good. What I had went to see was it had been done. The church was built. The people were worshiping. They were having service. And it was a blessing. It's satisfying when you have Christian fellowship. Sweet, savory, and satisfying. It was a good time down there. Fast forward another couple years, I go over to the Philippines. And I'm worried that I'm going to pollute their church because I'm an American. Sad, but true. But I get over there with the Filipinos. They speak English, hallelujah. And Dave, I was so impressed by their singing. This bunch of young college Bible students, they would sing these songs, especially one that I've never got over and probably never will till I get to heaven. And then I'll just get to enjoy it more. But it's called God Makes No Mistakes. And I have yet to find any other people that sing it like they do. They have Dalen probably knows the correct term for this. I don't know if it's a key, a bar, a string, a note, a chord, or what, but it's this certain pitch of their voices. Man, it is so soothing. And it just, man, I fell in love with it. I've got video somewhere around something, on some format that's probably ancient now, of them just singing. And I learned, when I got there, I went by myself, scared to death, never had flown nowhere like that, halfway around the world. And when I got in there and with the church, Cat, it's amazing how it's just like you're at home. And peace. And that's the way it should be when Christians get together. The fellowship is sweet. Not only do we see in verses 17 through 20 the fellowship that Paul received, they were glad he was there. He also brought with him some charity from the Gentile church. They had took up an offering to send back to Jerusalem, because remember what happened in Jerusalem when the church was birthed, the day of Pentecost. There was an uproar, and the gospel got dispersed. The Christians got dispersed out of the city, so they were struggling churches. But yet these Gentile brand new churches were willing to sacrifice and give to that Jerusalem church. And Paul has delivered that now. So then we go to verses 21 and 22, and this is where all the trouble starts. And it's amazing to me. You know, they're like, come here, Paul. We love you, Paul. God's using you. God's magnifying you. God's doing a great work through you. We're thankful for our brethren. But they understand they're in Jerusalem. They're not outside of the country. They're in the country where Judaism has still got a strong hold. They're in the country where the law is still upheld. Here's the thing. There's been a lot of rumors started. The rumor was that Paul had preached against Moses. Have we read that anywhere? Did Paul say anything about you ought to turn your back on the law? No, Paul has done none of this. These are just rumors. I hope you can go back and remember some of the other lessons we've learned. Remember, Paul actually circumcised somebody. Anybody remember who it was? Timothy. Remember? Paul actually circumcised him himself. So does that sound like a man that is against the law? No. He wasn't against the law, but he was mature enough to know that the law didn't have anything to do with salvation. And circumcision of the flesh, I know that's not something nice to talk about, but think about this. Here's what the gospel does. This is what the Holy Ghost of God does to a person. He don't circumcise your flesh. He circumcises your heart. He cuts away everything that's dead, and He puts life in your heart. And you live for Him, and you serve Him. When things get tough, you keep serving Him because it's in your heart. You have a desire. The law can't make you have a desire to love Him and follow Him. And that's what's going on. They've spread these rumors throughout Jerusalem. And then we see some of the people from Asia have come back to Jerusalem, and they're just there to point Him out. Now, let's discuss a little bit about this. What do you think about Paul when he's in verses 23 and up, when we see the circumcision and the customs.
they're accusing Paul of being a lawbreaker, which he wasn't a lawbreaker. He just realized that Jesus satisfied that law completely. They haven't got that figured out yet. The commotion was stirred up. And this is what James, the leader of the Jerusalem church, kind of like the pastor of that church, this is his take on it. We need to have people come together. A house divided cannot stand. He says we need to at least come together. And he says, Paul, you're a Jew. You know the law. You know all about it. You know it forward and backward. Would you be willing to do this? And Paul, he's going along with it. He goes along with it. The commotion was stirred up, and he said, we need to come together. So here's the remedy. This is how they're going to fix it, is they're going to let Paul go through some of this law ceremony stuff and let him be cleansed and purified to satisfy these Jewish law keepers. Let me ask you something. What do you think about this? I put down for my point that it's a controversial solution. They want him to make a vow and to walk in the law. Is there anything wrong with that? Do you think Paul should do that? Dalen, what do you think? I mean, he's been over there telling them Gentiles they don't have to adhere to the law. Miss Norma, what do you think? Miss Norma ain't going to say nothing. Dalen, what are you going to say? Should he or should he not? Was it a good idea or a bad idea? Why did he go about it? Why did he do it? Anybody? Come on, somebody got to have an opinion. Jared, you got an opinion? Was he right or wrong? That's a very good answer. He can't say it's right or wrong, but he said, I can understand, because he's trying to appease. He's trying to reach out to the people he dearly loves, his fellow countrymen. Let's look at it like this. If it was Americans and we had been outside of the country and we'd been in Africa and we come back home and we love our brethren, they're our brethren whether or not they believe right, they're still our brethren. What would we do? If we thought there was a chance to reach them and to get them to open their eyes and see. Now let me refresh your memory on some other things. All right, remember the law says that they should abstain from all these different kinds of meats. Remember that? The law says they can't have anything with cloven hooves, and there's a whole list of stuff. The Jews don't eat pork. Remember, they can't have no hot dogs and shrimp, no lobster tails, none of that stuff. Remember all that? What was the solution to that? Because Paul, and this is where you got to read the other books that Paul wrote, and it ties it all together. I mean, is it wrong, Kat, is it wrong for you as a Christian to eat a hot dog or a pork chop or some bacon? She says no. Everybody agree with that? Everybody agrees with that. Amen. Jared says hallelujah. But now, as a Christian, if we have a Jewish friend and a Jewish person we're trying to win to Christ, and they don't believe in Jesus, they don't believe the Messiah has come, and we're with them, are we going to eat pork and bacon and hot dogs? Are we going to take him down to the smokehouse? Why not? Because it's a stumbling block. But is it right or wrong? It don't really matter, does it? I can do without a piece of bacon to try to win them to Christ. Paul is trying to win them to Christ, so he's going to follow the law to try to appease them. It's the same thing. Circumcision. Will it make you any more godlier as a Gentile to be circumcised? No. Just like the food stuff. It won't make you no more godly. It don't add nothing to you, but it keeps people from feeling like they have sinned when they've been brought up in that society. See, you got to remember, these kids were taught from the time they were little that they had to do all this stuff. So I don't think Paul was wrong in it, doing it. And I don't think James, I can't fault James for coming up with us, trying to make a solution. Remedy was controversial. The solution, it never even come to pass. Because God stepped in. And that's what I like about it. In my eyes and my reading and my understanding, I don't believe Paul ever sacrificed. If you look with me on verse number 26, then Paul took the men, and the next day, purifying himself with them, entered into the temple to signify the accomplishment of the days of purification, until that an offering should be offered for every one of them. Now, do you take that it hasn't been done yet? The offering hasn't been slain? That's the way I take that. And then verse 27, and when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews which were of Asia, when they saw him in the temple, stirred up the people, and they laid hands on him. I don't think he ever did another sacrifice. I believe that was the hand of God stepping in. I don't know, was this all in God's plan? Then you have to decide, was Paul in God's will or not? If he was in God's will, then this is God's plan. If he was out of God's will, it's still God's plan because he just stepped in and caused something to happen. And you know, sometimes in my life, there's been times like that when I didn't know really what decision to make. I made what decision I thought was best, and then God will go with me through it. Let me tell you something, church. As your pastor, I don't know every right move to make. As Deb was saying, the devil's been fighting her all day. The devil's been fighting me ever since I got here. So I've wrestled and struggled with so many things. And it ain't like I had a whole council of men that I could go to and say, here's the problem. Y'all help me with the solution. Because a lot of it, it's been a solo run. So if you want to look at the church and blame somebody, I'd be the one to blame. Because, I mean, it looks like it does because of me. But at any rate, I did the best I could. Now, here's the thing about that. I'm going to pick on Cat and Jared a little bit. Let's say Cat makes a decision. I'm going to flip it around a little bit. And it may have not have been the best decision, but your team, right? You and her, y'all got to be a team. Can't divide the house. And you say, well, honey, that ain't what I would have done, which she's probably heard that before. But it's already been done. So you go with it. Let's say it don't turn out so good. Let's say it crumbles like a cookie. What do? Turn your back on her and walk off and leave her stranded on the side of the highway? No. You still trust God with it and go on with it. What am I saying? What am I trying to get across to the church? As the pastor, he's not the dictator. All he can do is say, this is my recommendation. This is where I think God wants us to go. And you can either be a yes man, a praying man, or a whatever man. I want you to be a praying man. And I will take into heed everything that I am told. But if we make a decision and we walk this way, know that I'm walking toward God and I'm trying to follow God. We may get over here and God's not there. And there I turn around and there all of y'all are. Well, look at the mess I've got us in. That happens all the time with people, with churches. Here's the thing. God is able to take all of our mistakes and still make His will happen with it. And that's what you got to realize. Paul did what he thought was right. Remember I told you the stress that he was under in last week's lesson? Oh, imagine what he feels like now. Oh God, my countrymen, they're all turning against us. The church in Jerusalem. Look, the churches I left over in Asia, they're doing good. They're fellowshipping and they're getting along. But then I come here to the what we could call the mother church, and they're divided and they're disgruntled because of me. And he's trying to fix this. Let me ask you this. How many churches are there? How many churches are there in the world? One? And who? It's God's church. Now, what church do you want to belong to? The Baptist church, the Lutheran church, the Methodist church, the Episcopalian church, the Catholic church? What church do you want to belong to? I want to belong to his church. And he only has one church. He don't have a Jewish church. He don't have a Gentile church. He don't have a cowboy church. He don't have a drunk church. He don't have a dopehead church, a pothead church. He's got one church. And it's full of those that love him and believe on him and trust him wholly. You know, it's funny how we want to, say, well, a lot of people say, well, I'm of Apollos, and I'm of Paul, and I'm of Jesus Christ, because he's the one that died on the cross to save my soul. Now, yes, I'm a member of Providence Road Baptist Church. Yes, my pastor was Charles Worley. Yes, he baptized me. Yes, I was saved under that ministry, but I belong to Jesus Christ and him alone. And this is the problem with this. And I believe this is why God stepped in, because it has to come to an end. And he's going to make Paul be the one that suffers through it, because he had already warned Paul. Now, I can give you a little precursor of what Paul's going to be saying in next week's lesson. Because remember, Paul, what was his job at one point in time? When his name was different, what was he doing? He was going and he was taking care of the very God, the people that God had saved. He was taking care of them because he didn't like them, because he wasn't of that way. Remember, he kept saying, way. Those that believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, plus and minus nothing. Law don't have nothing to do with it. Your belief on him, because he fulfilled the law. He removed that. That's why we have the new covenant now. Jesus ushered all that in. Next, let's look at this. Rescued from disaster. Verses 27 all the way to the end of the chapter. So Paul is pointed out. The enemies of God, they see him. They recognize him. They say, hey, that's that troublemaker. Hey, that's the one over in Asia that we saw. He's the one that put us out of business. I believe Alexander the Coppersmith might have been in there with him. Remember, he was mad because he tore down all Diana and all this little statues and copper stuff they were making. And I believe he might have followed them over there and started a new business. Because when Paul came into town and preached the gospel and people got saved and the church got started, we know that his business suffered. But we don't really call his name out. But whoever it is, they have followed him and they recognize who he is. And they've spread the rumors that Paul, he's the one that brings them Gentiles into the church. He's the one that polluted our holy sanctuary. He gets caught by the enemies. And this is what God kind of gave me this. And it was funny. I was thinking about it. So the Jewish people cannot kill somebody in the temple of God, right? So they grab hold of him, Miss Patty, and they drag him out of the church. And they drag him down all the stairs. And they get him away from the temple. And they start beating on him. Miss Norma, they're going to kill him. You know what? That's the best thing that can happen to somebody. If God reaches down and grabs them by the nape of the neck and jerks them up out of religion. Because that's all that is religion. They were just a bunch of blind religious people. They could not see the gospel for what it was. Jesus Christ and him crucified. Him risen from the dead. All the things that were done to show the power that's in God. But they closed their eyes to it. And they said, hey, we're not putting up with that in here. get him out of here. They take him out and try to kill him. God steps in. You say, really? You think God stepped in? Why would you say God stepped in? Because God used the Romans. They come in. They see the big commotion happening. It's funny, being in the mountains where we're at in this area, it'd be like somebody up on a mountaintop and they're looking down in the valley and they see Craig in an uproar and the Romans are in control. Remember, they run the place. They tolerate the Jews and they put up with them. But they look down there and they see a big crowd of people and a big turmoil, and somebody's done run told. There's always tattletales and talebearers running around town telling everybody's business and stuff. So they run back and say, hey, Romans, y'all better get down there, man. Something's going on. I don't know what it is. Something's going on. So here comes the Romans in, and they get a hold of him and they contain him. They get Paul. If there's ever been a time, I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where you got 2 or 3 people and you're on the ground and they're kicking and beating on you. It is nice when somebody comes in there and pulls them off of you. Trust me. Been there and done it. It's nice when you get a little relief. All you can do is roll and tuck and hide and try to cover, your vitals. I'll give you a little thing about that. On your knees and on your elbows with your head tucked up, that's the best place to be. You can't really cover everything. Your ribs are still exposed. But Paul was being beat to death, Dave. And I bet you when he looked up and saw them Romans pulling them people off of him, he was happy. He's like, I'm glad I'm getting some relief. Like Jared and Kat, when Kat's got the frying pan and Jared's on the ground and she's done got him lassoed to a tree somewhere and she's coming with the frying pan, he'd be glad to see somebody get the frying pan out of her hand. He's contained by the Romans. In other words, he's rescued by these Romans. And he's detained. I'd rather be detained than be being beaten on at any day in my life. And then we see as he goes through this containment period, they're helping him into the castle because he's been beat. He can't really go on his own power. He's probably got broke bones and broke this and broke that. I've never been over to Jerusalem, but I have heard that over there in that area, there's rocks everywhere. It's like a gravel bed. I remember Keith Schrontz went over there. He told me, he said, you know why they always talk about stoning people in the Bible? He said, because everywhere you go over, rocks cover the ground. He said, you can just pick them up. He said, it's a ready weapon available all the time. There's rocks everywhere. Can you imagine people stoning and kicking and beating on him? I wonder if there was somebody had a big old rock and he was on the ground and they was getting ready to bash his head in with it when the centurions showed up and pulled him away from them. But he was rescued by them, and then he's in the castle and he wants to talk to them. Now, the ruling authority is the Romans. I don't know Paul from Adam's house cat. All they are is the police officers. And evidently earlier, there had been a disturbance and somebody from Egypt caused it. And they thought Paul was this same guy. But Paul says, no, let me tell you who I am. Because the mob and the crowd, they couldn't even get straight who Paul was. That's the bad thing about a mob. They don't think. They just react. And it's funny, when we were getting the insurance for this building, in our insurance policies, there's some kind of a mob thing. And I thought, do I got to have that? Oh, yeah, you got to have that. I'm like, really? Yeah, it's built into all the policies now. Wonder why. Anybody remember what happened out there in Washington? The state of Washington, when they took over that town? I guess that got fixed. I don't know. I kind of lost interest in it. But that's why. A mob don't think for itself. They just react. And they're just reacting and following the rest of them. Well, he's over there kicking. I'm going to go over there and join him. And poor old Paul, he's the one suffering through all this. They can't even tell in verses 33. They ask who he is. They want to know who he is after they've chained him up. Nobody can even tell them. The mob's so out of control. The violence of the people, they beat him up, and here they rescued him. Paul says to him, but Paul said in verse 39, but Paul said, I am a man which am a Jew of Tarsus, a city in Sicily, a citizen of no mean city, and I beseech ye to suffer me to speak to the people. I wonder how many in that crowd that had been kicking and beating on him didn't even realize he was a Jew. I promise you, the next chapter, some of them that maybe picked up a rock, some of them that balled up their fist and hit him, had no clue who they were hitting on. And he's going to tell them in the next chapter all about his story, that he was just like them before he met Jesus. That he was as mean as all of them towards those that were of that way. But we'll see next week how he defends himself, for lack of a better way of putting it. Has anybody got any questions? I wanted to have more discussion on whether he was in God's will or out of